All right. Um, it is my pleasure to welcome you all back to the evening faculty keynote this evening for this early spring PCC symposium, and especially to introduce our faculty keynote presenter, Matt Siegel, who was not always a faculty member, but was at one point a PCC student, and has really been honestly a heroic figure in our online program, developing our online program, pushing for an online program. And without Matt, many of you we wouldn't be doing this, or this, our online program and our experience during this time of knowing how to connect and coming into this time of crisis prepared with the technological tools that we need in order to do this kind of a conference. That infrastructure within PCC is kind of down to Matt. And so I'm so grateful to you, Matt, for being who you are and the scholarship that you do and the way that you show up as a person and as a faculty member. And I'm so excited for your talk tonight. Oh God, now I've lost your title. There we go. I'm dealing with dual screens and I've lost your title. There we go. Science and the Soul of the World, Participatory Knowing in Goethe and Whitehead. And Matt, I know you don't want us to sing happy birthday to you, so we are not going to, but I wanted to wish you a happy birthday, and may everyone extend those happy birthday wishes to you. And I know that there was a early paper or lecture of Whitehead's that was just released that you got to nerd out about that this morning. So I'm sure that that was a great way to celebrate. And so anyway, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for giving this keynote, and welcome.
Thanks, Lily, so much. Turn your sound off. Okay. Hi. Thank you, Lily. So, I was reflecting on this presentation, and while I was listening to everyone else present, absorbing all of your ideas and being stimulated, and realizing that philosophy is this systole, diastole, this receptive and then expansive rhythm. And the two thinkers that I'm presenting today, Goethe and Whitehead, I've been thinking with for a long time, and recently, not only to prepare for this talk, but for the course on German idealism I'm teaching this semester, and also for a course I'm teaching at Schumacher, I've really been diving into Goethe's work. I've been enjoying a number of his books, especially on science, and this wonderful biography by Rüdiger Safransky. It's just to get a sense for who Goethe was as a person. And so I've been absorbing a lot, and it's really wonderful to have a captive audience for the next hour or so, so that I can reverse the vector and kind of share some of the things that I've been holding within my soul about Goethe and also Whitehead. Whitehead's probably my biggest philosophical crush. We've been going strong for 13 years now, just about. The late Professor Eric Weiss, who taught for PCC for many years, passed away recently. He was the first to formally introduce me to Whitehead when I started at PCC in 2008. And so I've been on a long adventure with him, and only more recently really developing a connection to Goethe as a person, understanding his biography, but also to his method and his way of seeing. And so I'm going to begin with a poem by Goethe. Tell it to no one but the wise. The crowd will only jeer. the living thing I praise that longs for death by fire, cooling in those nights of love, conceiving as you were conceived, a strange emotion fills you while the quiet candle gleams. You're no longer in the grasp of shadows darkening. A new desire lifts you up onto a higher mating. No distances can weigh you down. Enchanted, you come flying, and greedy for the light at last, a moth, you burn in dying. And as long as you lack this true word, die and become, you'll be but a dismal guest in Earth's darkening room. That's from a book of poems that Goethe published called West Eastern Divan. It's a beautiful translation by A.S. Klein. Learning German is one of my longer term projects, and I've come to understand that very few of Goethe's poems can really be translated so as to capture the depth of the play of language and the rhyme and the multiple levels of meaning. And so when we get a good translation of a Goethe poem, we should really be thankful for that. All right, how do I get my slides to move? There we go. So I want to begin kind of at the end, by which I mean, how did each of these two thinkers understand the purpose of thinking or the purpose of trying to know anything at all? Why? What's the purpose of that? It's not self-evident that we should even ask, what is nature? Whitehead says philosophy begins in wonder, and of course that's an echo of Aristotle. But then Whitehead goes on, at the end, when philosophic thought has done its best, the wonder remains. Nothing has been explained away, the wonder remains. There has been added, however, some grasp of the immensity of things, some purification of emotion by understanding. Goethe says that the highest thing a person can attain to is to marvel. When the archetypal phenomenon makes one marvel, we'll get into what that is, let one be content. To seek beyond it is futile, like children who, having looked into a mirror, turn it around to see what is on the other side. So the beginning and the end of philosophy for both of these thinkers, we can question whether Goethe was really a philosopher. I'll get into that in a second. But as thinkers, as those who two figures who desired to know, the beginning and the end of that activity is wonder, is to marvel, is to be content with the appearance of the archetypal phenomenon. So Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Alfred North Whitehead are in some ways ideal opposites. Goethe, of course, was a poet, also a scientist. Not as many people are aware of the significance of his scientific work. Certainly Goethe thought his scientific work was significant, and I think a growing number of scientists are recognizing the alternative scientific method that he articulated and seeing how in the context of an ecological crisis driven by a technologically oriented mode of scientific knowing, that there's reason to question that approach to science and examine Goethe's alternative. So in some way, Goethe contains within himself this ideal opposition or polarity, right, between artist and scientist. But in relation to Whitehead, this polarity is heightened and intensified, which, as we'll see, is very important in a Goethean way of knowing, this notion of polarity and intensification. Whitehead is a mathematician by training. His first major book in 1898 was titled Universal Algebra, and he was inducted into the British Royal Society for that accomplishment. he later, after the various paradigm shifts that took place in physics in the early part of the 20th century, he made his way first into the philosophy of science and then into full-blown metaphysical cosmology by the time he was asked to come teach at Harvard. As Lily mentioned earlier this morning, I was participating in a group of, I think it was about 70 Whitehead scholars from 14 different countries around the world. And we had just read a recently discovered manuscript from 1924 when Whitehead gave his first lecture at Harvard. I can share that with anyone if you'd like to see it. It's literally a scan of the typed out manuscript that he was holding in his hands. It's for someone like me who has been studying Whitehead for so long, is very exciting. So my hope is that by bringing these two thinkers in the conversation, there's plenty of confluence, as we'll see, but they also represent these ideal oppositions that in some way the insights that they each articulated will be intensified, and that by holding the two together in our minds, we can correct for any imbalance that might exist in each of their ways of approaching the nature of nature. So, as I mentioned, Goethe was really no philosopher. He was constantly trying to get philosophers to explain himself to himself in a way. He wanted to, he begged Fichte to explain, how the mind is related to nature. He wasn't really satisfied with Fichte. And then he formed this deep relationship, sort of like a father-son relationship with Friedrich Schelling, another German idealist. And Goethe influenced Schelling's view of the natural world, just as sort of bringing Schelling down from the heights of his idealistic perspective, getting him in touch with experiment and experience. But Schelling also directed Goethe's attention to the underlying implications of his own way of seeing the natural world. Schelling wrote a book in 1798 called the Weltseele, which means world soul in German. It's a long title, all about universal organicity and so on. But the basic idea for Schelling was that, look, Goethe, you're exemplifying the sort of connection we should expect to exist between the human mind and the natural world, if indeed the entire world is a living creature, and we are organs within this organism. So Goethe was surrounded by philosophers, but was not himself a philosopher. Much later on, in the 1880s, Rudolf Steiner was asked to edit Goethe's scientific writings. And Steiner's constantly saying, Goethe didn't fully understand his own methodology. He tried to find hints to help him articulate it in all of the idealist philosophers. But Steiner saw his role as providing this methodology and this philosophy. And I think Whitehead also provides us with a philosophical basis for Goethe's way of seeing nature. So one thing I want to address here is this question of anthropocentrism in Goethe's view of nature and of the human place within nature. Very often, I think the default position among ecological philosophers and activists and environmental ethicists and so on is often to rail against anthropocentrism. And I certainly understand why. There are many good reasons to bring the Promethean self-understanding of modern human beings down to size before we destroy ourselves. On the other hand, I think there's another way to understand what it might mean to honor the unique place of the human in the universe. And here's another way that this ideal polarity between these two thinkers comes out. For Whitehead, his work, he's a panpsychist, right? Which means he thinks some degree of experience is present everywhere. Human beings are not the uniquely subjective beings in the universe. There's subjectivity everywhere. And so for Whitehead, human consciousness isn't really all that special. He's not really that concerned with it. He has a theory of consciousness that's quite profound, but it's not the center of his philosophy. It's not, human consciousness is sort of, it's derivative from the primary process that his cosmology is really trying to understand. For Whitehead, every entity is significant of the whole of reality. Whereas for Goethe, he sees the human being as the fruit of living nature's creative metamorphosis, right? The fruit is the final stage of development of a plant, right? And so Goethe would say the human being is the fruit. So we're not just another part of the universe, we're a very important part, because just like a fruit contains the seed within it, the human being, as the fruit of nature's metamorphosis, contains the seed of the whole. And Goethe's call was for humans to learn to die and become, right? The fruit has to rot for the seed to get to the soil to grow again, right? So die and become, so that we can see that this seed in us is the spirit of nature, right? That might be born out of us. And so, as Nietzsche would later say, the human being is sort of a passageway. It's not a destination. We are not an end, but a means. You know, while we may be the fruit of nature, there's a process beyond us, and Goethe wants to call us to participate in that as only we can, right? As human beings. Rudolf Steiner puts it this way. He says, and this is in his book, Goethean Knowledge. It was published as Goethean Knowledge. I think this was part of the many volumes of Goethe's scientific work that he published in the 1880s, and it was later assembled. He says, "What have the true philosophers of every age wanted to do? Nothing other than to make known the essential being of things, that the things themselves express, when the human spirit offers itself to them as their organ of speech." So there's a sense in which the role of the human being is to express the essence of nature to itself. So to help make this contrast between Whitehead and Goethe to seem less severe and to point towards the confluence, these are the last lines from Whitehead's book, Modes of Thought. He says, "Philosophy is akin to poetry, and both of them seek to express that ultimate good sense which we term civilization. In each case, there is reference to form beyond the direct meanings of words. Poetry allies itself to meter, philosophy to mathematical pattern." All right, so to further cement the confluence between Goethe and Whitehead, despite their polar oppositions on some issues, I'm sharing this quote without telling you who wrote it. "The maximal conceivable truth is in an idea would seem to be that it should lead to an actual merging of ourselves with the objects, to an utter mutual confluence and identification." Sounds like something Goethe would say. It's also a great definition of what participatory knowing would be. But it's not Goethe, it's actually the radical empiricist William James. And whoops. Sorry about that, it jumped ahead for some reason. And James is seated there next to Josiah Royce, and the two of them are another ideal pair of opposites who, through their ongoing dialogue and debate with each other, I think intensified one another's thought. James was brought to a new level of understanding, as was Royce, as a result of the polarity that existed between them. James, the empiricist, the pluralist, and Royce, the idealist. But so this is William James, and I show this quote from James because Whitehead inherits perhaps the only two thinkers he inherits more from would be Plato and Wordsworth. But James might be, Whitehead calls James the American Plato in a letter he wrote to one of his students, Charles Hartshorne. Hugely influential for Whitehead's understanding of his methodology of radical empiricism, which is basically attend to experience. Don't look for something beyond experience that might explain experience. The point of philosophy and of science is to look at how different aspects of experience are related to one another, and by seeing those relationships to elucidate the nature of experience. There's nothing beyond it that might explain experience. And Whitehead engages his adventure in cosmology, applying James's methodology, and articulates his whole philosophy of organism, as he calls it. And so I think if you're familiar with Goethe at all and you read this quote, I'm sure you saw how it easily could have been something that he said. So again, hopefully the confluence here is becoming more obvious. So this is The School of Athens by Raphael. Plato and Aristotle are holding it down for their respective orientations. Aristotle was critical of the so-called Platonic theory of forms or ideas, but Aristotle was also himself a Neoplatonist. So we can't really pretend like Aristotle was dismissing his teacher. He was just, I think, offering a new theory of the theory of forms. And so in going back to Plato and Aristotle here, and then I'm going to move through briefly a brief history of science as the evolution of phenomena. And we're going to begin with Plato's understanding of astronomy. Plato, of course, pointed to a reality that was beyond appearances and thought that this realm of forms, which were eternal, they have being and they don't become, right? He thought that those were the causes of the apparent world, and that, and I have to say, in Plato's dialogues, all the best refutations of the ideas that he's known for they're also in there. So to say that this was Plato's theory is to say that this is an understanding of the nature of the universe that's profound, that he tried to articulate through the mouthpieces of various characters in many of his dialogues. But what Plato himself really thought, we would have had to have been in the academy listening to his oral teachings, where he tells us in one of his letters, he actually communicates wisdom. His dialogues are guides for those who have already had that insight that can only be communicated in person. So keep that in mind when I talk about what Plato said or what Plato thought. So Plato, these are some medieval scholastic terms in Latin that capture the difference between how each of these figures understood the role of ideas, or archetypes, you might say, to connect it to Goethe's approach. Antirem means that Plato thought that forms were before things, right? Antirem, before things. You could say above things if you want. Whereas Aristotle thought that the forms were in things, right? So he paid very close attention to the way that forms, that essences showed up in the realm of sensory experience. How does the eternal essence shine forth in the realm of appearance? And so, Aristotle studied the morphogenesis of organisms through the various stages of their embryological development, and had very organic understanding of the nature of appearance as something which participated in the realm of forms, but the forms were in the things. Plato says, yes, they're in the things, but they're also before the things. And Plato tended to give primary reality to the things, or rather, Plato tended to give primary reality to the forms rather than the appearing things. And then there's another scholastic term, post-rem, which is the forms being after the things, which is kind of a way of talking about what gets called nominalism, where we might say, a modern materialist might say, and William James, I think had he ever had a chance to talk to Whitehead, Whitehead may have been the only person who could have talked James out of his nominalism. But post-rem means that the forms aren't really in the things. The forms are something the human mind adds to things. We have these ideas and these concepts and we apply them, and nature itself is barren of form. There are merely particulars, right? So that's what that post-rem would imply. Neither Aristotle or Plato held to that view. And so as I go through this history of science as the evolution of phenomena, I wanted to share this Goethe quote: "The history of science is science itself. History is a contingent process of unfolding things that are surprising or constantly interrupting the linear course that you thought you were headed on." And so the typical view of science would be that it's based on observation, experiment, hypothesis testing, and it's got a very linear track towards the truth. Goethe thinks science is bound up with history and bound up with human culture, bound up with all sorts of assumptions that are not themselves scientific. It's not just about cataloging the facts and testing hypotheses. There's a role for observing the facts, but there's more to science than that. So we have to study the history of science as a process of metamorphosis, as an evolutionary unfolding whereby the nature of appearances themselves and how human beings conceive of their relationship to those appearances is changing. So before I get into Plato's astronomy, this is Ludwig Wittgenstein, and one of his students was Elizabeth Anscombe, another famous British philosopher, analytic philosopher, and I'm going to tell this story to you. Wittgenstein once asked, "Tell me, why do people always say that it was natural for men to assume that the sun went around the earth rather than that the earth was rotating?" His student, Elizabeth Anscombe, answered, "Well, obviously, because it just looks as if the sun is going around the earth." To which Wittgenstein replied, "Well, what would it look like if it had looked as if the earth were rotating?" And so this might at first seem a little bit like elliptical and confusing, like what is he trying to say? But what Wittgenstein is illustrating here is the often subtle way that thought participates in fact, right? And so we might think we're just seeing what's there, but really we're seeing how we are predisposed to think about what's there, right? Obviously, if the heliocentric and the geocentric models of the solar system are both an attempt to save the appearances, which is to say, it looks the same either way. There's nothing in the observation itself that tells us which one is true. I mean, now that we've been in rocket ships in outer space, we have a different vantage point. But from the surface of the Earth, how would it have looked if it looked as if the Earth were rotating? The same way as if the sun's going around the Earth. So thought plays a role, right, in how we perceive the world. Whitehead says something similar. The history of thought shows that false interpretations of observed facts enter into the record of their observation. Thus, both theory and received notions as to facts are in doubt. It would be so much easier for us if the facts spoke for themselves. I'm thinking in particular of our current day political squabbles, but it's just the nature of reality that facts don't speak for themselves. Makes our work that much harder in attempting to know the truth. So let's get into Plato's astronomy here. This is a series of photographs of Mars going retrograde. And for Plato, someone who thought that the visible universe was an image of an eternal and perfect idea, this imperfect motion, planet in Greek means wanderer, this imperfect motion was a problem. And so Plato kind of inaugurates the science of astronomy with his problem of the planets. And he says to the astronomers who were studying with him and to the future scientists who would try to solve this problem, he says, how is it that this appearance can be explained by reference to some perfect geometrical motion that we cannot see? And obviously, 2,000 years later, Copernicus came up with the heliocentric model. He didn't come up with it, actually. He cribbed it from some Pythagorean mathematicians. We'll get more into Copernicus in a second, but we can see how the mathematical solution of putting the sun at the center saves the appearances by explaining that actually it's the Earth that's moving, right? But sticking with Plato's view of the sky, he referred to the visible planets and stars, which, you know, again, someone thinking that the true nature of reality is this perfect eternal form. And then you look at the night sky and yeah, it's beautiful and sublime, but it's like someone splattered paint randomly, right? It's not ordered. It's clearly numinous, but Plato looked at it and to him, what it looked like was an embroidered pattern, but we're looking at it from the wrong side, from the back side. He says, these embroideries in the heavens are decorations on a visible surface and are to be regarded as the fairest and most exact material things. But we must recognize that they fall far short of the truth that can be apprehended only by thought, not by sight. We must use the blazonry of the heavens as patterns to aid in the study of those realities, just as one would do who chanced upon diagrams drawn with special care by an artist. So if we were standing in the ideal realm, the pattern seen right side facing us, you know, looks like this beautiful tree, but we can still tell from the backside that it's a tree. It's just a little bit more disordered. And so Plato saw the beautiful heavens as this sort of portal that through its motions that weren't exactly ordered, but that were ordered enough to, I mean, Plato says the stars taught us mathematics, right? So they're ordered enough to teach us mathematics and guide us to the realm that's even beyond a mathematical knowledge, but is a participatory or intuitive knowledge that involves actually ourselves merging with the idea by which the whole of reality can be comprehended, right? Seeing the pattern from the right side, understanding the order that shapes the cosmos. This is Ptolemy's model of the universe, right? And so he was an astronomer who for many hundreds of years had the ancients thought solved Plato's problem. His model with the Earth at the center and these various circles upon circles of deference and epicycles, he had managed using perfect circles to explain the apparent motion of the planets. And it's a very predictive model. It's not perfect. But neither was Copernicus's model when he first came up with it, because Copernicus still had perfect circles, and it wasn't until Kepler and Newton fixed his math, adding the elliptical motion of planets and some other fixes, that it was only after that that the heliocentric model became more predictive than Ptolemy's model. And there's a way in which the use of epicycles in Ptolemy's model of the solar system is an analogy that still holds in the way that scientific materialism operates today, in that there's a model centrism in science, where scientific materialism tends to posit the existence of a mechanical reality beyond our capacity to perceive that is the cause of our perception. And so there's a hypothesis that's constructed by which the appearances are to be explained, and we test those hypotheses based on observations and experiments. But Ptolemy was really suggesting that there is something, like Plato said, beyond this appearance. But he was humble in that he didn't think his model was the way that the universe, the way that God actually did it. The shift to modern science is a shift from an attempt to develop hypotheses to save the appearances to now an attempt to develop hypotheses to explain the appearances, to explain them away ultimately, by reduction to something more primary that we can't even perceive, right? Because it's the cause of our perception. So in other words, atoms and molecules and such. And so it's modern science, scientific materialism is unlike Ptolemy in that they're not as humble. There's no humility in it, in that they recognize it as a model. They've collapsed the difference between model and reality, but still it's the same approach in that it's centered on model making. Is the point I'm trying to get across. Hope that's clear. So this is a picture from Copernicus's book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres that was published after his death in 1543. It had this preface in it by a friend of his, a theologian named Osiander, who, as I was just trying to explain, Osiander thought he was doing Copernicus a favor by saying to the reading public, hey, Copernicus doesn't really mean that this is the way the universe is. He's just trying to do what Ptolemy was doing, save the appearances. Because his friend Osiander was worried that Copernicus's name would be at risk, that he would be accused of all sorts of things, atheism and contradicting the Bible and going against the religious view of the nature of the universe, which has the sun stationary at the center. Unfortunately for Osiander, but fortunately for Copernicus, ultimately, the subsequent scientists who followed in his wake took it as more than a mathematical tool to improve the calendar. They said, no, Copernicus thought the sun really was at the center. Giordano Bruno was one of the earliest to inherit Copernicus's ideas and say, that's how the universe really is. And he got burnt at the stake, not just for that. He was apparently not an easy person to get along with. But the history of science obviously took Copernicus to be saying more than just that this is a helpful model that we can use to make our calendar more accurate. But another important part of Copernicus's discovery, although again, he was drawing on ancient Greek astronomers and geometers, he's not just making a scientific discovery, he's also being driven by a philosophical a philosophical allegiance to a Platonic understanding. He was a Neoplatonist in the Renaissance sense of Neoplatonism. He had spent many years in Italy, and so he had that intimate connection to Italian Neoplatonism, Renaissance Neoplatonism. He says, at rest in the middle of everything is the sun. For in this most beautiful temple, who would place this lamp in another or better position than that from which it can light up the whole thing at the same time? For the sun is not inappropriately called by some people the lantern of the universe, its mind by others, and its ruler by still others. The thrice greatest labels, Hermes, the thrice greatest, labels it a visible god, and Sophocles' Electra, the all-seeing. Thus indeed, as though seated on a royal throne, the sun governs the family of planets revolving around it. So Plato, of course, develops an analogy in the Republic whereby the sun is a symbol of the good, right? And we only can see anything in the sensory world because of the light of the sun, just as for Plato, we can only know anything in the light of the good. And so the sun as the highest principle, a symbol at least for the highest principle in Plato's philosophy, deserves to be at the center. So this is one of the motivating factors for Copernicus, because again, at the time, his model was not as accurate in its predictions as Ptolemy's was. This is René Descartes, and he takes Copernicus's astronomical paradigm shift and moves it into philosophy, begins the move into philosophy. See, Copernicus is telling us this, our sensory experience that made it seem like the Earth was stationary and the sky was moving was mistaken. And through geometry, this abstract way of knowing, we access the true situation. So don't trust your senses, trust these mathematical patterns. Descartes takes this to an extreme, and he doubts everything that he experiences through his senses. He says, I will think that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all the external things are no different from the illusions of our dreams, and that they are traps. He, the evil demon that he's imagining is deceiving him, he has laid for my credulity. I will consider myself as having no hands, no eyes, no flesh, no blood, and no senses, but yet as falsely believing that I have all these. And so this is from Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. He's trying to find a new foundation for philosophy, and by doubting everything in his sensory experience, he arrives at his own thinking activity, his own doubting, and realizes that even an all-powerful evil demon couldn't take away his own activity, his own capacity to think and thereby to doubt. And so it's more like I doubt, therefore I am. But what Descartes believed he had discovered was a new foundation for philosophy. And from this thinking activity, he recognized the clarity and distinctness of mathematical forms and said, okay, we can know nature because nature is just a pure extended geometrical grid. What we think we're seeing, the colors, what we think we're hearing, the bird song, that's all a projection of our soul. Nature itself is just this extended mathematical grid. And because we have such clear and distinct knowledge via our own inward mathematical intuitions and deductions, we can have perfect knowledge of nature eventually after we do enough science. So Descartes is really extending Copernicus's astronomical paradigm shift and drawing out its implications for philosophy and for this new method of science. This is a famous painting by is it David Casper, Friedrich David Casper, I think. Might be getting these various names mixed up.
Caspar David Friedrich.
Caspar David Friedrich, thank you. This is Immanuel Kant up here. And he takes this trajectory beginning with Copernicus and being amplified by Descartes. He takes it even further, but in a way, recenters the human in an interesting sense. So Descartes, let me get my people right. Kant calls his transcendental philosophy, his new method of philosophy, a Copernican revolution in philosophy. Whereas before him, philosophers and scientists had assumed that the subject who wants to know about nature must conform to the way the objects are in nature, right? That's sort of common sense understanding of how knowledge occurs. The subject conforms to the objects out there. Kant says, actually, no, the objects are appearing to us as a subject, and we don't have any access to anything beyond that. So really, it's the activity of the subject that the objects have to conform to, right? It's our sensory organization and the way that we have experience of space and time as our own, as provided by our own sensory and mental activity. It's in that context that objects appear. And so rather than the subject conforming to the objects, Kant says the objects have to conform to the subject. And so he's putting the human back at the center in a way after Copernicus had set the earth in motion and pushed it out of its perch at the center of the universe. This is Kant's tombstone, upon which is written in German and in Russian, because interestingly enough, the Kant was at the time living in Prussia, but after his death and the wars, it got absorbed into Russia. And so it's in Russian and German, and the translation is, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. The more often and perseveringly my thinking engages itself with them. The starry heavens above me, and the moral law within me." And so for Kant, the starry heavens represent the Newtonian understanding of the mechanistic universe that's determined universally and necessarily by these mathematical laws, right? And Newton was universally considered to be the genius that had provided near complete understanding of the physical universe. And Kant knew he had to do justice to this understanding of the starry heavens as a deterministic machine known via mathematical geometric modeling. But then there's also the moral law within him, which is our sense of freedom as human beings. Yes, our bodies are part of nature and thus must in some sense be mechanical, but we experience, Kant argued, we experience freedom directly. Through our moral experience of freedom, Kant thought we directly participate in the ideal realm that Plato was talking about. We pierce beyond the realm of phenomena that he limited our knowledge of nature to and participate directly in this divine realm. And through that participation flows our freedom. And so Kant has this profoundly split view. And in his first critique, you're left with that stark division between freedom that we feel on the inside and determinism that we measure and theorize on the outside. And Kant tries to work through this in his various critiques. And it was his final critique, the critique of judgment, wherein he began to engage with life, biology, and he recognized that those Newtonian laws that apply to everything else in the physical world as it appears to us, they don't apply to organisms, because organisms exhibit a form of causation that is circular in a way. Rather than the cause being external to the effect, the cause and the effect are bound up in this mutually constituting relationship, whereby, in an organism, there's metabolism. There's what nowadays gets called autopoiesis or self-production. And so an organism is the cause and effect of itself. And its end is internal to itself. It's not shaped by the purpose of some external designer. And so Kant realized in organisms, there was an example of at least a inkling of freedom, an inkling of the sort of thinking activity that he otherwise would only give to human beings, present in organisms. There's something like an idea that's at work in shaping an organism at the metabolic physiological level and shaping its behavior as well. And so this destabilizes Kant's whole transcendental philosophy when he begins to get into the nature of organisms. And okay, now finally we get back to Goethe, who read the Critique of Judgment and thought at first that he had recognized a philosophical explanation for what he himself was capable of when he engaged in plant morphology and the study of the growth patterns of plants according to this archetypal law. He was seeing the idea at work in the plant organism, and he saw the idea at work in animals as well. I'll talk more about his understanding of metamorphosis in a second. Here, this is Goethe, more towards the center of your screen, a statue of him. There's statues like this everywhere. There's one in San Francisco outside the young art museum in between the Academy of Sciences of Goethe, and then Schiller, who was another close friend of his, a poet, playwright, man of letters. And in a sense, they're both ideal opposites again, and had an intense relationship where they raised one another to higher capacities of expression. Schiller was a Kantian. Goethe tried to explain his way of knowing the growth patterns of plants. And there's a story that is related that Goethe tells. One of the first times he and Schiller hung out, he tried to describe how he can actually see the idea or the archetype at work in the growth of a plant. And Schiller said, "You're not seeing that idea, you're imagining it. It's your mind is in a sense projecting it." And Goethe was not happy with this at all, because for him, he was paying as close attention, loving attention to the growth of those plants. He knew he was not projecting anything. He was allowing the plant itself to take root and grow in his imagination. But he had to work out with Schiller, the Kantian, who, so for Kant, the reason organisms disturb his transcendental system of philosophy is that we can't have mechanistic knowledge of the life process of an organism. Kant said, he admitted it. He said, biology will never be a science. There will never be a Newton of even a mere blade of grass, was Kant's way of phrasing it. There will be no Newton of the grass blade, meaning there will never be a mechanistic explanation of life, even for something as simple as a blade of grass. But Goethe said, no, I can give you scientific knowledge of how living organization operates. So Goethe is piercing this veil that Kant had erected. And he doesn't just apply it to the organic realm, he applies it to the physical realm. Here's a picture of Newton doing his famous experiments on optics and his developing his theory of light and colors according to his hypothesis that light is corpuscular or made of little particles, and that due to the diverse refrangibility of the prism, light can be split apart, and Newton therefore thought that light was a ray, or came in rays and that light was compound, and that it could be decombined or decomposed into these colors as a result of the angles that the prism, through which the prism transforms the rays. Goethe hated this idea, absolutely hated it. And in his theory of colors, which he worked on for decades before publishing, is this like raging polemic against the Newtonian way of looking, again, as I was explaining earlier, for a cause behind phenomena, particles that would cause us to have vision of particular colors. Nowadays, there's still this idea that wavelengths of light cause us to experience, by interacting with the rods and cones in our eyes, certain colors of the spectrum. And that's not totally wrong, but Goethe's point would be a wavelength, a mathematical model of a wavelength is not a color. Like, if you want to actually know what red is, you got to look at red and see how red, see how red is in the context of our holistic visual experience in relationship to other colors and relationship to colors that aren't there. Goethe saw the human eye as playing an active role in the production of colors in nature. It's not that the eye was projecting color, it's that rather than color being in the wavelength of light as science understands it, or color being a projection of our mental activity, Goethe thought it was in the intermingling of the two. And he also gave an important role to darkness in this process, that light, when it meets darkness, their interaction, the interaction of light and dark, give rise to the spectrum of colors. And so rather than look behind phenomena, Goethe says, The highest would be to realize that everything factual is already theory. The blue of the sky is revealed through the basic law of chromatics. One should never search behind the phenomena. They in themselves are the teachings. Whereas hypotheses of the sort that Newton worked with are lullabies by which the teacher soothes his pupils to sleep. Goethe says nature will reveal nothing under torture. And he thinks that the contrived artificial experimental situation, locked in a dark room with a pinhole and a prism and just at the right angle and the right distance from the wall, Newton produced his famous color spectrum and had this crucial experiment that he thought proved his theory of light and color as particles of different sizes and shapes. And for Goethe, experiment is really important, but you've got to do a lot of them. And you've got to do them not just in these contrived artificial situations, but like go watch the sunset. Go take a look at the phenomenon that he was really interested in, colored shadows. And I'm going to play a clip from a documentary that tells us more about colored shadows. And this will be a minute. And then, can you guys hear that? No, can't hear it. Okay.
It's really low.
We're going to skip that because I'm low on time anyways. It's basically illustrating what a colored shadow is, where if you have an object like a cone in the middle with two light sources, if you start with white light, you'll get a no shadow, obviously, if you're getting light from both sides. If you turn off one of the lights, you'll see a gray shadow on one side. If you add a color gel to one of the lights, a blue light, say, hits one side, and then white light on the other side, the shadow on the far side of the blue light will appear to us as the complementary color, yellow. And so the eye, Goethe would say, is providing the wholeness that the appearance is lacking, filling in the complementary color. And so this is the participatory understanding of the nature of color that Goethe developed. Goethe says that the human being is the most perfect instrument for the study of nature. Nowadays, we erect these gigantic particle accelerators to collide bits of energy at the highest velocity we can manage. And then we measure the explosion with these very sensitive instruments and run that data through a supercomputer. Actually, there are multiple supercomputers all over Europe and in the US, and they're feeding this data everywhere, and they crunch the numbers and they come up with, we found the Higgs boson. This is amazing. But I wonder to what extent the theory or hypothesis, the model that pre-existed the construction of this device, is shaping the way that nature is showing up as a result. We came with a hypothesis already formed, and we imposed the hypothesis on nature, twisted nature's arm to get it to conform to this, to show up for our detectors to measure in just this way. To what extent is the knowledge that we're producing in any way distorted? Not that we should not be engaging, and that not that to dismiss the standard model of particle physics. It's brilliant, but it's a model. What is its relationship to human experience? That would be the question that Goethe would ask. This is a quote from Whitehead now, as we bring it home, and I'll try to go for 5 more minutes and then stop to hear from Sean and then engage in dialogue with everyone. This is from that lecture that I was studying this morning, Whitehead's first Harvard lecture. He says, according to the view which I am putting before you, there is nothing behind the veil of the procession of becomingness. Though there is much pictured on that veil and essential to it, which our dim consciousness does not readily decipher. Indeed, the metaphor of a veil of appearances is wholly wrong. Reality is nothing else than the process of becomingness, of which we are dimly conscious. Every detail of the process is open for consciousness, though in fact our individual consciousness is only aware of a very small fragment of what is there for knowledge, what is there potentially. Goethe says, he has this phrase that he repeats in various ways in different poems, that nature is an open secret, right? An open secret. It's not hiding anything, it's not veiling anything, but it's still secret because we have to become adequate to it in order to perceive it. We have to engage in the sort of loving or gentle empiricism, the radical empiricism that Goethe and Whitehead are counseling. So back to the theory of metamorphosis here. Goethe studied the critique of judgment, as I mentioned, and in this critique, Kant mentions this possibility of an archetypal intellect, which would be different from what he calls our own type of intellect, which is ectypal, which for Kant has to do with the way that for us, in his opinion, our human nature is split. On the one hand, we have sensory experience. On the other hand, we have intelligence or reason. And so in our way of understanding the world, we can only try to determine sensory appearances according to certain concepts that we have. This is unlike a divine intellect that has no such division and can perceive the ideas directly in the things, which is exactly what Goethe was claiming to do. So he says, though Kant in the Critique of Judgment seems to be referring to a divine intellect, yet just as we are able to elevate ourselves to a higher region in the ethical sphere, remember Kant said, through freedom we participate in the supersensible ideal realm. Just as we are able to elevate ourselves to a higher region in the ethical sphere through belief in God and virtue and immortality of the soul, the case might be the same in the intellectual sphere, in our attempts to theorize nature, so that by intuiting a continuously creative nature, we make ourselves worthy of intellectual participation in its productions. This was in an unpublished note that Goethe started composing. He had just published The Metamorphosis of Plants and afterwards read Kant's Critique of Judgment, which was also just published that year. And Goethe realized he published too soon and he rushed to try to get at least another essay written that would explain the connection to Kant's work, but he never finished it. But luckily he didn't destroy the note either. Okay, last slide here, just to give you a sense for Whitehead's perspective. He views nature as an event, right? Becomingness, right? There's no holding nature still to look at it. It is in its essence passing, as are we, as the being trying to know it. So everything is process. And there's no division for Whitehead between the part of that process that physicists are studying and the part of that process that poets are composing their songs about. He says, scientific materialism bifurcates nature into two divisions, namely the nature apprehended in awareness and the nature which is the cause of awareness. The nature which is the fact apprehended in awareness holds within it the greenness of the trees, the song of the birds, the warmth of the sun, the hardness of the chairs, and the feel of the velvet. The nature which is the cause of awareness is the conjectured system of molecules and electrons, which so affects the mind as to produce the awareness of apparent nature. Thus, there would be two natures. One is the conjecture, and the other is the dream. So this is the view he's very critical of, that he's protesting against. He says instead that for natural philosophy, if it's to be coherent, everything perceived is in nature. We may not pick and choose. For us, the red glow of the sunset should be as much part of nature as are the molecules and electric waves by which men and women of science would explain the phenomenon. So he's trying to heal that rift, right? That beginning with all the way back to Plato, this division between the apparent and the real, and made even more severe after the scientific revolution, and more severe after Kant's revolution. Goethe and Whitehead are trying to heal that split. And so I'll leave you with this on also from that first lecture. I had to get another quote from that first lecture in here. Whitehead says, "Neither in science nor in philosophy nor in any branch of human achievement do we reach finality. The data of crude evidence upon which philosophy works is provided by the general state of civilized thought at the epoch in question. In one sense, philosophy does nothing. It merely satisfies the entirely impractical craving to probe and adjust ideas which have been found adequate, each in its special sphere of use. In the same way, the ocean tides do nothing. Twice daily they beat upon the cliffs of continents and then retire. But have patience and look deeper. You find in the end whole continents of thought have been submerged by philosophic tides and have been rebuilt in the depths awaiting emergence. The fate of humanity depends upon the ultimate continental faith by which it shapes its action. This faith is in the end shaped by philosophy." All right. 7:06, not bad. I went a little long, but thank you for your attention. And let me stop sharing my screen. And I'd love to hear from Sean and then from everyone else.
Wow, thank you, Matt. That was. Can you hear me? Okay, great. What a great, stimulating tour of the evolution of the Western mind. It was really phenomenally done. I was trying to figure out what could I ask you to draw something out that is maybe implicit, but that I didn't see it fully developed, but which I know you are fully engaged with and might want to bring into relationship with what you did share with us. And this is my attempt. So let's see if it works. So, I love the way you show not only this development, but the tension between and the ideal movement from a more, a more detached to a more participatory worldview, from one that is focused on static being to one that is recognizes and honors becoming. Also the shift from, let's say, the stars as the visible model of truth, of the ideal, to the organism, to life. I think you captured that really well. So what I noticed when you brought in Kant and he that famous quotation about the starry skies above and the moral law within, and I was aware of, wow, there seems to be a gap, or there's some sort of gap between these two. But then, as you helped us remember with the third critique, it's life, it's the organism that bridges that gap. And yet, with Kant, as with Whitehead and even Goethe, and even Whitehead, who's later, one thing that I find missing that is the what I would call maybe the concrete universal. So the way I'm seeing this also is a movement from an abstract universality, which we can associate with Platonic forms or the Cartesian geometrical universe or the Newtonian theorem, to a more concrete universal, which in our time, for me, is this living earth, is Gaia, is this planet. Excuse me. So this is something that I don't see yes, with Kant, there's certainly a sense of an international, of a kind of quasi-planetary internationalism. Excuse me, I'm having a little allergy attack here. I need some liquid. But there's no sense of the living earth, and particularly as it or she has emerged through Gaia theory and so on, as another self-organizing, as a self-organizing system, in the way that Kant and Goethe saw plants and other animals to be. So my question for you is, where is Gaia and where's the Earth in these figures, or how would you bring them into service of the Earth? Not only our understanding of Earth as the kind of concrete universal that I feel that they were intuiting and helping us to intuit, but in service of the healing of the Earth, which is now dying as well as becoming. So die in order to become. That's my question for you.
Thank you, Sean. That's a great question. The concrete universal, I think, in one way, is what they're pointing to with the organism, but they don't directly point to the Earth organism. I was trying to remember, I know there are hints in Goethe's different writings about nature and the Earth, of the idea of the Earth as an organism. I can't recall a specific line to share with you. I just remember it was beautiful, so I'll just take my word for it. But they point us towards the notion of the Earth as you put it, Sean, Anthropos. It to me feels like Anthropos is the perfect concrete universal idea to capture the sort of anthropocentrism that we need, where the human's role is really to recognize the Earth as not a stage, but the main actor. Humans, the bad kind of anthropocentrism is Earth is a stage for man's march of history, right? But now the Anthropocene is an opportunity to recognize that the importance of the human being is, as in a way, like as Steiner said when I started, we're the poet of the Earth, in a sense. To put it simply, the consciousness of the Earth, right? And it's not that that consciousness is just in the human. The consciousness, I think, has to be in the way that a panpsychist like Whitehead would suggest. It's ecologically extended. While from a superficial point of view, we seem like we're skin encapsulated organisms, we couldn't survive. If you dropped us into deep space, we'd evaporate in a fraction of a second. So the whole environment is involved in our metabolism and in our ongoing organization as an individual amidst the community of other organisms. And so I think there are ways that they point to this concrete universal, and I'm really glad you drew that out. Whitehead in Science in the Modern World talks about the rise of industrialism and the way that it just ravaged the Earth, and he's really worried about the trajectory of it, writing in 1925. And he's like, he zeroes in on exactly the problem, or one of the sources of the problems is that we don't view value as intrinsic to the non-human world. We think humans have values. We can distinguish, as I did earlier, between human beings and the rest of the natural world. I think moral agency is something I have trouble imagining as not being uniquely human. I wouldn't hold a dog responsible for biting a child. You might need to find ways to prevent the dog from biting other people, but you're not like punishing the dog. The dog's just being a dog, And you want to be compassionate with human beings too, because we're not always free either. Freedom is a capacity that human beings can have, but it's something we're called to realize. And if we can realize it, then we can become responsible for the Earth. And that's our unique difference, but that unique difference is exactly what connects us to the universal in the most concrete way, right? Yeah, I think
That's wonderful. That's so beautiful. Can I ask one more? Yeah, because I want to give time for everybody else to ask
Sure.
questions.
I'll just go. Yeah, sure. I'll have a quick answer.
No, you can take as long as you want. I'll try to make my question short. So as I know, you know full well, again, I mean, Matt and I are so close. I mean, I can't really imagine anything but differences that add excitement to the romance. But there's no fundamental incompatibility. So as you know, so Goethe is one of the sources through Schelling, apparently, of the idea of a dynamic evolution. And by dynamic evolution is very close to what we in PCC tend to also associate with the evolution of consciousness, which is not just the idea of development or becoming, but it's development or becoming with a specific lure or telos, which is most developed in Hegel, as you know, who Goethe took that quote from Hegel, by the way. His science is the history of science, just as philosophy is the philosophy of science. He learned that from Hegel. So it's very prominent in Hegel and Schelling. Where is it in Whitehead and Goethe? Or is it just development and becoming and flow, like as it is for James, or is there something more fundamentally compatible in both Goethe and Whitehead to this more Schellingian and Hegelian and Steinerian view of evolution? And that'll be my last question.
Yeah, sure. That's another great question. I did emphasize the process dimension of their thought, but both of them, Goethe put the archetypal phenomenon, or the archetype, it's not exactly like what we normally think of as Plato's idea of the idea, but I think on a deeper reading of Plato, it's exactly what Plato was talking about. But so there's the idea of the organism as such, and then as a sort of species from that genus, there's the idea of the plant, there's the idea of the animal, and the archetype is like, in the case of a plant, for Goethe, it was the leaf, which he admitted was a kind of metaphor, and I've struggled to understand, what do you mean everything in the plant is a leaf? But he was saying, because it's misleading, because he's pointing to a factual structure in an already formed plant and saying everything is that, but you have to see it as a metaphor for a hidden archetype that can't be pictured in that way. It's a dynamic process of unfolding according to a form, according to a pattern that we perceive only in the process of the unfolding through the entire life cycle of a plant. So you don't see it at any one stage, but when you take in the whole thing, there's a lawfulness at work, Goethe would say, and every organism has this archetypal lawfulness, and in interaction with the contingencies of the environment and the adaptation that takes place, it's almost like there's a active force coming out from the organism, which is the archetypal power, and it meets the active force of the environment, which is why we have such diversity of life. It's not like the archetype is just pumping out identical copies of each organism, right? And in Whitehead also, he has these eternal objects that ingress into the flow of occasions of experience. And a lot of people come to Whitehead's thought because they're into the organicity and they're into the becomingness, and then they start reading about eternal objects and they get really turned off. Like, how does that fit into a process philosophy? It fits in a really crucial way, because Whitehead wanted to be able to point to, as you were suggesting, Sean, a kind of directionality to the flow of becoming. There's a lure, and the role of eternal objects is to lure becoming to take on certain forms. The eternal objects don't control what happens. Indeed, the agency is really in the creatures who are calling upon or ingressing the forms, but the forms are called upon because they're desirable, right? So the organisms desire, and the forms are certain ideal possibilities that help guide the growth of an organism or the evolution of an organism. And so, whereas, see, Darwin actually lists Goethe as one of his main influences in The Origin of Species, but the neo-Darwinians totally flatten out Darwinism into this very mechanical process. And then the molecular biologists don't even have organisms anymore. They just have genes churning out copies of themselves. But Darwin himself also recognized the need for some sort of archetype to explain the body plans of organisms. But Goethe's view of dynamic evolution, I think all of the German idealists' view of it wasn't just of like an organism is mutating at the genetic level and passively selected by a fixed environment, and that's what gives rise to all biological shapes and forms and behaviors. No, for Goethe and Whitehead, the organism has agency. The organism is adapting the environment to its own needs and desires as much as it's adapting to the environment. And so that is a very different view of evolution. It's not just evolution by natural selection in the way it's normally understood. And so many contemporary Darwinian biologists would look askance at a Goethean or Schellingian or Hegelian view of evolution. But I think there's reason to look again, even to look again at Darwin, their own teacher and master of this theory of evolution, to see what was between the lines in his original articulation of it. I mean, Darwin was already a bit mechanistic, but there's another reading of Darwin as a romantic biologist, I think. And so my hope is that by, bringing Goethe's scientific work more into the conversation in the philosophy of science and natural philosophy, that we can explore this alternative, so that it is more, at least better understood. I think a lot of the disagreements with it don't even understand it at this, right now. It's just a misunderstanding of what Goethe was trying to say.
Thank you, Matt. As Robert would say, for you and I, to be continued. I'll leave it to other people.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Those were great questions. Anybody else have a comment or question?
Robert, I think.
Robert, you're muted.
You have to unmute yourself.
Okay,
There we
thank
go.
you. I was too excited to think about that. Matt, it's a simply gorgeous, wise, and beautiful lecture. And I'm thinking of what can I say to be as an adequate compliment, except maybe to say that, like, philosophy is the history of philosophy. You are yourself, as I observed tonight, a walking philosopher, a kind of a passion of the Western mind, just right in front of us. And I think of you as a Platonist, and Plato, of course, was the great dramatist of ideas. And you have that sense of how ideas are playful, and they come and they do their service, and then they get picked up, and then we get Aristotle. And that you did a beautiful rendering of Kant. And I just love that you have that epistemology, but also with the, with his moral law. And you have this deep sense of ethical freedom and ethical responsibility, which I think came through several times tonight. And like Goethe, I think you are a phenomenologist, like James as well. But in any case, you're reading nature in a way that is really quite profound and informed. And of course, you're a Whiteheadian with, so you have this great science background. And then you go into all these other fields, into metaphysics and into civilization. And that, I think, was really the most exciting part of tonight, but also the way I think of you, is that you are a civilizational person and that you're really using ideas to move us along. As you know, I think Whitehead finishes with beauty, and so you're trying to get ideas that are that will inspire us and enable us to solve problems and to create a better world. So I just think it was a totally beautiful, inspiring talk, and I thank you with all my heart.
Thank you, Robert, for those kind words. It was a lot of fun. It always is fun for me, and I think that's the important part. What you said reminded me just at the end there, this line from Whitehead where he says, "Ideas are like frozen fish. They won't keep. Something must be done about them." You know, so Whitehead had this sense that we're not just as philosophers trying to contemplate the nature of the truth in an abstract, disembodied, unworldly way. We must be loyal to the world and find ways for our ideas to be effective. And again, he's drawing on James's pragmatic orientation. He says something like the elucidation of our practical experience is the sole justification for any metaphysical thought. You know, so I definitely inherit that orientation. We have 4 more minutes. If anyone wants to chime in.
I'd like to ask a question. I'm just coming across Whitehead for the first time in modern physics, so this might be something that I might encounter later in the course, but your talk got me thinking, and Sean's questions as well. When you first compared Goethe and Whitehead in this sense of Goethe, you know, this positive anthropocentrism coming through Goethe is also, you know, the fruit maybe at the crown of the tree of life or something like that, right? And I don't know if you covered it and I didn't catch it, but with Whitehead, is there a telos? And I mean, I know you mentioned it's, you know, human consciousness is kind of derivative, but I imagine as a philosopher, as a wanderer, he also loves human consciousness in some way, shape, or form. So I'm curious what the telos or goal might be for each to contrast specifically, or if they even speculate that far, or if, like you said, they just kind of say it ends in wonder and there you go. Yeah.
That's a great question. Sean hinted at this already, that the purpose of the universe for Whitehead is beauty and ever more refined and intense realizations of beauty. And whether or not that beauty is experienced by or given form by a human being is not really what's important for Whitehead. It could be that human beings are especially sensitive to many forms of beauty, but Whitehead would probably say we have every reason to believe that we're not the end of nature's capacity to realize beauty. And indeed, you know, so it's this question of our freedom as human beings allows us to play this very unique role in the universe if we live up to our potential. But if we don't realize that freedom, we have the power to destroy much of the earth and ourselves in the process. You know, so it's like human freedom places us on this precipice between good and evil. And in that sense, Schelling has this beautiful line. He's quoting another philosopher, Franz von Baader, and it's the line is that, you know, human beings, when we do horrible things, it's not that we regress to the level of animals. Human beings can only be higher or lower than animals in the sense that our freedom brings us into the moral realm of good and evil. We don't think of nature as being capable of evil, right? That seems to be a unique capacity that human freedom brings onto the scene. And so, you know, that's why Goethe has this sense of the human as unique. With Whitehead, I get the sense more that, you know, his ultimate principle is creativity, and it's it's pervasive in the universe. Human freedom is a sort of flower on that creative tree. It's not, it might be a more intense form than any other animal on this planet. Maybe not. I mean, I was told that humans are the only species that mourn the dead. And then turns out there's dozens of other species that mourn the dead. And so, you know, we have to be careful when we try to figure out what is unique about the human, but I think we get closest when we think in terms of freedom and what being would you hold morally responsible for an action, you know? But yeah, for Whitehead, the end is beauty, and whether that comes in a human form or not is not what's important for him.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jasper. Well, I guess we're at time, so feel free to email me if other thoughts came up and you didn't get a chance to ask, or I know it's intimidating to get on a webcam sometimes, so I'm happy to chat with you some other time, one-on-one. So thanks again for your attention.
Thanks, Matt.